as someone who's covered reproductive access for years now, this is a moment that both Republicans and Democrats have been pushing towards and warning about, this post-Roe reality. We're here now. It's an untested moment for the electorate, for politicians, for this country. And 10 years from now, this will be an inflection point.
That was our guest, Ali Vitali, the author of the new book, Electable: Why America Hasn't Put a Woman in the White House Yet. I'm Mark Updegrove, President and CEO of the LBJ Foundation.
And I'm Mark Lawrence, Director of the LBJ Presidential Library, and this is With the Bark Off. Journalist Ali Vitali is a familiar face on America's TV screens, having covered politics first for MSNBC and then for NBC News for nearly a decade. She reported on the 2016 race won by President Trump and then returned to the presidential campaign trail in 2020 when she covered several Democratic candidates, including the record-setting 4 women who competed strongly for the nomination.
Ali talked with us about the obstacles that female contenders have faced in running for the presidency over the years. She also discussed how those challenges might be overcome and the prospects for electing the nation's first female president.
Ali Vitali, welcome, and thank you so much for being with us this morning. Ali, you covered the 2020 Democratic campaign, including at times all 3 of the women candidates. But how did you come to write a book about women running for the presidency?
Hi, guys. I'm really excited to be here with you. And the book really came from the reporting that I was already doing on the road for NBC. I had covered, of course, 2015 and 2016 on the Republican side, 2018 covering everybody in the midterms, and then 2019 and 2020 largely covering the women who were running, but with a special focus on Amy Klobuchar and Elizabeth Warren. When they dropped out within a matter of days of each other, I was standing outside Elizabeth Warren's house talking about the fact, not just that Biden and Bernie were the ones that were left, but the fact that there were no women now left in this race after having the most diverse field of presidential candidates that the country had ever seen. 6 women running for this office, 4 of them senators with really viable paths to the presidency, and to end up with what we had always seen before, with the exception of 2 times in history, was, I think, for some voters, a stark reminder that this is still something that we've yet to achieve, a woman president.
How did your own experience as a reporter affect your thinking about the female candidates in the race?
I write about this, about how one of the ways that I think we can get to making these presidential contests more equitable, just in allowing the candidates to run on the policy as opposed to getting bogged down in some of the isms, as I would call them, racism and sexism and genderism that sometimes plague these presidential contests. I think part of that is having a diverse press corps, because you're less removed from the lived experiences of these candidates. You're no longer immediately filtering things through the straight white male lens. When it comes to people, for example, like Kamala Harris, I remember after she first announced her bid, a few days later, she went down to an event for her sorority, a celebration of the Divine Nine, the Black sororities. And for people who don't understand why those are so important, not just to Black people, but to women, it might seem like an odd detour from the presidential campaign trail. But in fact, those types of communities can be instructive to the way that Harris or other candidates who might call themselves a part of those communities see themselves as leading and building community on the road. And so I think having less space between the lived experiences of the candidates and the reporters who are covering them can sometimes help us avoid the pitfalls that we saw happen in 2020, that we certainly saw happen in 2016, and in all of the contests before that. So for me, I found myself always being aware of the subtleties that can sometimes manifest with misogyny on the campaign trail and when these narratives are being built in the press. And I felt more empowered to call them out because I trusted my gut. If something felt a little misogynistic, it probably was misogynistic. and it was helpful to have women around me as well who could say, yeah, that kind of felt that way.
How important is the continued diversification of the media to the ultimate project of getting a woman elected to the White House?
I think it's really important, not because women reporters have the job of elevating women in the press. That's certainly not the goal here. And as I say in the book, and as I say often, I'm a political reporter first. And it's why in this book, I focus so much on the political reasons why these women did not win the Democratic nomination in 2020 and why we haven't had a female president yet. But if you look at the political reasons and the moments that these women operated in, there's often that intangible percentage that is unexplained for why those things meant they didn't become the nominee or the president. And it's that intangible that I think is gender, because you can't quantify it, but it's very much there. And sometimes when we can't put a number on something, we tend to discard it or gloss over it. But instead, what I try to do through this book is filter moments that we all experienced in 2020 and 2016, even as far back as 1984 with Geraldine Ferraro and Walter Mondale, and say that gender played a role, put that gender lens over it. And my goal is that the more that you do that, the more you have a hard time disbelieving that gender plays a role here. And frankly, once you see it, it's hard not to keep seeing it, and it's a lot easier to call it out. And so for women reporters, it's being empowered to do that. And frankly, as I look at 2016 and 2020, having more women out there with me also made it easier for all of us to collectively say, hey, during the vice presidential sweepstakes, as we call it, when there was a whole news cycle about how ambitious these women were as if it was a bad thing, we all kind of were able to say, well, ambition's not a bad thing. And here's why. You don't just happen to be vice president without a little ambition.
So Great Britain just elected its third female prime minister.
Yeah.
It just put to rest a head of state who presided, a woman head of state who presided over the country for 70 years. Put America in context of the developed world in terms of our not having a female head of state to this point in our history.
I think Britain is a really fantastic example on the side of doing well with elevating female leaders. And by and large, they've done that from the conservative side of their spectrum, which is important because it's what many of the women who I spoke to for the book, including Hillary Clinton, said could easily happen here as America tries to notch its first, just because throughout history, you've seen women elevated from the conservative side of the spectrum first. Clinton was very quick to caution me that that's not what she hopes happens. But as a student of history, it's what she's prepared for in some ways. But then also when you look at Britain, the fact that they've been able to elevate these women from larger governing bodies, from their parliamentary system, it's a question of systemics. The way that we elect women, the way that we elect candidates here, of course, is not through a parliamentary system. But if we did, we would have President Nancy Pelosi. Of course, that's not the way that we do things here. But at the same time, there is a question of system. And then I also think, and this was a larger conversation that was happening as the world was saying goodbye to the Queen, is many people there, including Liz Truss, I believe, said this, that having a woman atop the monarchy there and in a position of leadership for decades and decades allowed a certain comfortability with seeing women in power. And it sort of took away the permission structure there to say, well, women can't be leaders in this fashion, in part because they had seen Thatcher. But prior to that, they had seen the Queen. And that was really important because there is an aspect to this that's seeing is believing. And part of it in the United States is the imagination barrier. The fact that when women run for president, not only are they doing what every candidate does, which is saying, imagine me in the Oval Office. Women have to go the extra step and say, imagine me, someone who has never looked like any president before in the Oval Office.
Ali, your book very naturally focuses on 2016 and 2020. But you note at the beginning of the book that some 22 women have actually run for president throughout American history. Remind us quickly who some of those women were and who ran for president most memorably.
Yeah, well, I mean, I really start with my focus. Of course, there were women who were running even before women had the right to vote. And certainly I focus on some of the women who ran even before women had the right to vote, in part, Gracie Allen, part of a comedy duo who did so as a joke, but still managed to earn votes even after dropping out, which to me, I choose to believe that says something, right? That there was even then a hankering for female leadership. But nevertheless, I think the people who I really focus on, Shirley Chisholm in the 1970s, the first Black woman to run, Patsy Mink, the first Asian American woman to run, though her bid was more symbolic than Chisholm's. Although Chisholm, I remember when she decided to run, the bid itself was met with laughter. And then to have just several decades later, and I know several decades seems a quaint phrase, Kamala Harris running her own presidential race with logos and colors in the logo and nods to Shirley Chisholm's candidacy about how progress is slow, but progress does come. And it's also a reminder that for all of the women who are running in the 2020 field and who will run going forward, they are all building blocks on top of the women who came before them. And there are positives to that, but there are also drawbacks to that, in that every woman who runs, her mistakes will be reflected on the women who come after her. And we watched that happen in 2016 into 2020, but we also watched that happen as far back as, 1972 to 1984, when you saw the elevation of Geraldine Ferraro, to 2008, when you saw the elevation of Sarah Palin. Progress has been slow, but all of the women who come after are often compared back to the women who came before them, fairly or unfairly. This is just what happens because we have so few touchstones. And so the fact that you have 22 women running for president prior to this moment, then it just means that we're building the book of who we have to compare people to. And now you have any number of ways to run for president after 2020 as a moderate Democrat, as a progressive Democrat. And it doesn't just have to be, well, are they Hillary Clinton or are they not? Because there's a lot of other ways to be female and run in this century.
And perhaps the most accessible and memorable touchstone that women will have going forward is the candidacy of Hillary Clinton in 2016. And of course, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by nearly 3 million votes, but lost the Electoral College. How did gender factor into her loss in 2016, Ali?
Well, so look, when I talked to Secretary Clinton for the book, she gives the explanation that it was gender, but it was also Russia, it was Comey, it was WikiLeaks, it was Trump. And I think that when you look at the hangover of 2016 onto 2020, exactly what we were just talking about, how the women who come before are then comparison points for the women who come after. The election of Donald Trump in the minds of Democratic voters was such a shock, and people struggled so much to understand it because all of the metrics by which we judge what's going to happen in a presidential contest in 2016, the polls infamously, many of them said Hillary Clinton was going to win. People were confident in that metric. People were confident in that prediction. And so it was a shock to them. When I was on the road then in 2019 and 2020, the only thing that Democratic voters wanted was the assurance that they could nominate someone who could win. And it seemed like that manifested as in 2016, one woman lost to one man once, and it made the entire endeavor of women have an extra air of risk on top of the fact that all of the women candidate were battling the imagination barrier that we were talking about earlier anyway. All of them were already saying, I want to be a historic candidate. And ultimately, what some of the women who ran decided after they dropped out, and I'm thinking specifically of Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, saying to me that she didn't feel that in 2020, any woman could have won. And in part, that's because electing women is still carrying an air of risk. And in 2020, this electorate on the Democratic side was so risk averse that they felt more comfortable going with someone moderate on the political spectrum and also someone who had looked like almost everyone that we had already seen before.
So much of your book is a very careful analysis of many hurdles that women have to clear in order to be viable political candidates, especially for the presidency. Let's talk about some of those barriers. For example, you point out that women candidates, and for that matter, candidates of color, are often pigeonholed as being naturally interested mostly in the concerns of the groups that they represent. So women care about family issues, Black candidates care about race and so forth. How can we get beyond the situation so that, a female candidate, for example, could appeal more generally?
This was actually a really fascinating feedback loop that I came across as I was talking with smart people for this project. The idea, first of all, that candidates like Julian Castro could come out and make their first priority immigration because he was the only Hispanic candidate in the field. And there's a double-edged sword to that of course, this would be his inclination. He is there to speak on behalf of his community. And then also the fact that he then only becomes the immigration candidate. I think his words were the brown candidate on the brown issues.
Right.
It's something that his campaign was so aware of. And in talking to his campaign manager, they sort of felt backed into a corner in that this was authentically where he was interested. But at the same time, when you're running for president, you are trying to be president of everyone. And so there is an objectivity that is offered to straight white men in these fields and white men broadly as they run for president on a whole wide range of issues. But at the same time, when you look at someone like Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, who hinged her candidacy on issues of the family, she came out with the Family Bill of Rights and went around Iowa and New Hampshire touting this. One of the things that she would say regularly on the campaign trail is she would say, I'm going to take care of your families in the way that I take care of mine. She had pink in her logo. She was not shying away from the idea that she was a woman and a mother who was running. But at the same time, it was one of the reasons that she and others around her think that she got caught in this silo of being just the woman running on a set of women's issues, despite the fact that Gillibrand has a much larger portfolio, including in the foreign policy and veteran space in Washington, that she definitely was talking about on the campaign trail. She was talking about healthcare. She was talking about climate, just like all the other candidates were. But because she centered herself around so-called women's issues, it ended up being a feedback loop that didn't make her wide-ranging or appealing. There were other reasons for that. Her name ID was low. She was already a lower-tier candidate when she got in. But at the same time, she was a sitting senator. She was a viable option for president. I think there's progress points in this too, though, because those feedback loops are evident, and there are certainly examples of that. But at the same time, we already saw that Barack Obama was able to campaign and win without being pigeonholed in that space. But then also people like Senator Elizabeth Warren came into the race at the top tier, always alongside Biden and Bernie. And that, of course, is the way that the race ended up shaking out. But Warren was able to campaign on things that were technically care economy issues, which are usually associated with women, things like universal pre-K, universal childcare. She often talked about her time as a teacher, which is a predominantly female field. And yet she was able to achieve wide-ranging support, not in the way that she needed in order to actually notch delegate wins, win states outright, and become the nominee, of course. But at the same time, Warren was able to break out of that feedback loop a little bit. So there are progress points, and then there are also still the drawbacks. But these are all things that candidates for non-white and non-male campaigns have to be thinking about. It's not as simple as just go out and campaign for president on what's authentic to you. It's you have to think through that there will be ramifications for that white male candidates don't have to think about.
You cite research that suggests that women have so many more obstacles when they run for office than men. And one of the obstacles they have is the likability factor.
Oh, yes.
Talk about the likability factor, Ali, and how women can ultimately overcome it.
Well, I do think that in part, the likability factor is amplified by reporters asking the simple question, are you likable enough? Which, as it even comes out of my mouth, makes me cringe. And it strikes me that as recently as 2008, this was a question that was not just asked like in gaggles on the side of a campaign stage, but at a debate when Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama had that seminal moment of a moderator asking her something to the effect of, you're very qualified and voters see you that way, but they wonder if you're likable enough. As if you have to be likable in order to lead as president. And of course, it leads to that moment with Barack Obama saying, well, I think you're likable enough, Hillary. And he was dinged for that because of how dismissive it was. But nevertheless, Hillary runs again in 2016. And there's a headline in the Washington Post about how the likability metric, however fair or unfair, is still going to be at play in this. And on the one hand, it's a question that we've largely stopped asking, but we found other ways to ask it. I think electability became the replacement ability in 2020 because we knew after 2016 that likability was gendered. But electability in and of itself is also gendered because it's a metric that you can't quite place your finger on. And the ways that the women in 2020 went from proving likability to electability, we can get into. But if we stay on the likability metric, the reason that it's so important is it's not just nice to be liked. Everyone wants that, but it's not just nice to have. For women, the studies that I point to in the book show that they actually have to be liked to earn votes because voters are less likely to vote for a woman who they don't like as opposed to voting for a man who they don't like. When I was on the road with Trump, I heard this constantly. I don't like him. I don't like the way he talks. I don't like some of the things that he said or done, but I'm still going to vote for him. It's really hard to find that for female candidates.
So you had that with men too, to a certain degree. I mean, with I remember in 2000 it was Al Gore squaring off against George W. Bush, and it was who would you rather have a beer with? You know, right?
Exactly.
If you're flipping a coin about this, ultimately, who do you want to go have a beer with? And George W. Bush was the guy you'd rather have a beer with than Al Gore, but
which is gendered in and of itself too, right? The idea of the way that you compare gender is a word with two sides, right? It is male and female, and so when you look at the way that you ask men to fit into those machismo and like macho masculine categories, who would you rather have a beer with? That's about as macho as it gets, right? And the fact that you're saying, all right, well, George W. Bush is more typically male to me than Al Gore, who presented more intellectually more stiff. He was less, especially in comparison to Clinton, who he was governing with at that point. Like, the comparisons for Gore were tough. And I talked to people in Gore's orbit about this, but certainly the have a beer metric also drives me crazy. But it's also an example of how gender is playing even for guys.
Yeah.
You also point out, Ali, that women are often penalized for seeming to want it too much, right? For being overly aggressive, overly ambitious. And you very deftly show how this came into play with Kamala Harris, who delivered a real zinger at one point against Joe Biden. And at first it seemed to go over quite well, but then as you chronicle, over time it didn't actually sit so well. And she was penalized in some ways for having really tried to land a knockout blow. Talk a little bit about this problem of assertiveness, of wanting it too much, and how that plays into the candidacy of women.
And this shows up a few times when you talk about Kamala Harris throughout 2019 and 2020. First, it shows up on that first debate stage when we're down in Miami, 2 nights of debates, but Kamala Harris is on the second night with Joe Biden. And he's the front runner. Of course, everyone is going to go for him. That is politics 101. And also none of the stuff that's really, truly viral on a debate stage hasn't been prepped or workshopped somewhere. So the dirty secret is out. A lot of these zingers are things that campaigns have workshopped and that candidates have worked on. But that ended up being part of the problem here. The fact that Kamala Harris not just went at Joe Biden with the "that little girl was me" moment about busing, but the way in which people felt that it was a low blow, that it was too much beyond the pale of what normal politics would be, when really that same series of debates, I can't remember if Swalwell was on the debate stage with Biden or if it was the night before, but there was a lot of talk about Biden's age, about needing to pass the torch, about him being out of step with the moment. Men also attacked Biden. Everyone attacked Biden. He was the guy to attack. But after the debate ended, it broke apart in 2 ways for Kamala Harris. The first was politically, because the attack sort of fell apart in the details. It turned out that their position on busing, which was not a front and center issue for voters in 2020, their position actually ended up being pretty similar. So it fell apart in the details. But then there was the part of it where voters took it really personally. And I would talk with people who said, well, I was really interested in Kamala Harris, but then I saw what she did to Joe Biden, and we shouldn't be doing that to other Democrats. There was sort of a finger wagging and a disappointment with her on a deeper level that I never really saw too many parallels of when men would attack men. I mean, we watched everything that happened in 2015 and 2016, and people hated Ted Cruz, but it wasn't because of what he said to Trump on the debate stage. It was just that he wasn't going along with Trump at the convention. Of course, things have changed now, right? But broadly, that kind of deep betrayal, this sense of she wanted it so bad that she'd go after Biden that way. It felt really gendered. And that was the second way that it sort of broke apart for Kamala Harris.
We talked about likability as an obstacle for women, but you also point out that there's also the experience obstacle for women. Men can run on potential, but women have to demonstrate experience. How do we change that?
I think that thankfully this is changing just because both parties have done such a good job of investing in their pipelines. I think the good news coming out of this book is that Republicans and Democrats much more slowly than I think most of us would have liked, but they all realized that there's a big return on investment when you run good female candidates in House races, in Senate races, gubernatorials, mayorals, whatever, across the map. So now I think as you look to 2024 and beyond, gone are the days when you lack viable women who could jump in. That's not to say that they will. And certainly in 2024, it's a process governed by two older white men simply because Biden and Trump are the heads of their parties. And that's the pecking order usually for these things. But I do think that we're still going to be able to see viable women run, whether it's Liz Cheney, or ultimately if Biden himself doesn't run, Kamala Harris is certainly in that mix along with several other people. Because the pipelines are fuller, you have women who are qualified, who do have the resumes. And I think that's actually a really big progress point as we look at, we're falling short of the presidential metric, but America is doing a better job filling the bench with people who could eventually break that glass ceiling.
Yet another trap for women seems to arise when it comes to showing emotion as a candidate for office. You know, someone like Biden, as you chronicle, can show emotion and get credit for it, right? He comes across as a humane, sensitive person, which were clearly among his major assets when it came down to the election in 2020. But a woman, as you point out, runs some risks here. How big a barrier is this problem for female candidates?
Runs risk in emotion, regardless of how you're showing it. Emotion in the happy sense, the sad sense, the angry sense. Biden is a really fantastic comparison point for this throughout 2020, simply because there were moments where he would literally yell at voters. I mean, he challenged them to push-up contests. He called them dumb. There was another moment where he got into a shouting match during a campaign stop at a manufacturing plant over gun rights. And people looked at that moment as he was, screaming at voters, which I would advocate is probably not good strategy. But they saw it as a moment that it was a selling point. It was a sign of his strength. Whereas I don't know that I could find a comparison of Hillary Clinton or Elizabeth Warren or Kamala Harris just unleashing on a voter, challenging them to a push-up contest and having that play well. In fact, the counterpoint to that, right? And I can't remember if this made it in the book because there was so much that I wanted to pack in, but the comparison point to Biden yelling at voters and being celebrated for it is Elizabeth Warren having some sassy moments during a CNN town hall on LGBTQ issues where she said that people who don't support gay marriage just shouldn't get married. And it was a really viral moment. It showed her wit. It showed her sass. She was not yelling. She was not angry. She was just clear in her policy with a little bit of comedy to it. And somehow it was a viral positive moment that also showed exactly why people don't like Elizabeth Warren. That was an op-ed that was out there. And again, it was a reminder that we have given men a lot more leeway in showing emotion. And that's a positive thing because it allows men to be men, not just in the traditional 1950s sense, but in the sense that they are complex, wide-ranging emotional individuals and should be allowed to be compassionate and angry and all the things that people are. But we don't necessarily give those allowances yet to women, whether it's Hillary Clinton crying in 2008, and there are still questions about whether or not that was political or real. It's Geraldine Ferraro accepting the nomination in 1984 and reminding herself and her daughters not to cry because they knew that would not be well received for someone trying to fit into positions of masculine power in the vice presidency or the presidency. So those reminders are still there. We've widened the gap for what's acceptable for male candidates, but we are much slower to do that for women.
So the key in 2020, Ali, for the Democratic Party was finding a candidate who could wrest the presidency from Donald Trump. And while many Democratic voters were definitely open to a woman candidate, they concluded that a man was best for the job, and the man obviously was Joe Biden. Was 2020 a particularly bad time for women despite the abundance of women candidates?
I love this question because I think that the women candidates who I talked to all came out with different answers to this. We talked already briefly about how Senator Gillibrand's deduction at the end of it was no woman could have won in 2020 because the environment was so much that there was a skittishness around Trump. There was the hangover of Hillary Clinton. Klobuchar and Warren, I think, took different lessons from that. And certainly I didn't speak to Kamala for this, but you got to imagine that hers is slightly different too, because she still managed to be historic at the end of 2020 by being elevated alongside Biden. But the other piece of it is, I think these women understood that they were battling on two fronts, the imagination front, but then also the Hillary front that was complicated by Trump. And I'm wondering if the field looks a little bit more normalized after him, because he is such a complicating and emotional factor for Democratic voters that he really was the thing that loomed over every single thing in 2020. And again, it strikes me that the lesson that voters took from 2016 was that because he beat one woman once, every other woman would have that battle ahead of her. And the concern was that because he has no floor in terms of what he's willing to say, he's willing to say things that are not just dog whistle sexist, but outright sexist, not just dog whistle racist, but outright racist. There was the concern that he could say the quiet parts out loud and somehow that would speak to the worst angels of the country and fell these candidates, despite the fact that he's an equal opportunity offender and has said this stuff about every man who was supposed to be a rising star in his own party, plus Hillary Clinton. So Trump is a complicating factor that I think is irreplicable. But at the same time, he's still very much in the mix right now, and he's going to be a factor in 2024 as well.
Despite the peculiarities of 2020, I wonder how we'll look back on it 20 or 50 years from now. To what extent do you think voters became more comfortable with female candidates in a way that will create greater opportunities in the years ahead?
I don't know that they knew they were getting more comfortable as they were doing it. Some people I spoke to were thinking about gender front of mind, saying to me, I really want to vote for women. I think we have a great field of women. That's not something, by the way, that you would hear on the Republican side necessarily, just because they deal with gender and identity in such different ways than Democrats do. But I think that because we had so many years there where women were not even on the ballot, they were running, for example, in 2000 with Elizabeth Dole, she dropped out, though, before votes were cast, right? So it's not like voters in Iowa and New Hampshire were actively considering whether or not to vote for a female candidate. Now, 2020 allowed them not just the opportunity after 2016 to vote for a woman, but to consider a whole group of women, from Tulsi Gabbard and Marianne Williamson to Gillibrand, Harris, Klobuchar, and Warren. And I think that just by doing that, it normalizes it. And I write a chapter in the book about how I spent Memorial Day weekend out in Iowa, and I was just assigned to the candidates who were campaigning. And it struck me that I was covering three women who were viably running. I spent the day with Gillibrand, Klobuchar, and Warren. The whole weekend was me covering women. And it wasn't just because, oh, Ali's doing a weekend about women story. It was just, these are the candidates who are out on the trail who are most interesting. Let's go send a camera and a correspondent there. And that normalization is so critically important. And having more women continuing to run only continues to normalize it, because at a certain point, as several operatives said to me, it's a numbers game.
You talked earlier, Ali, about the fact that Hillary Clinton suggested that the first woman president may well be a conservative.
Yep.
What do you think led to her believing that the presidency might be gained by a Republican candidate? And do you agree with that assessment?
There's a few things that were packed into Secretary Clinton's assessment there. And it was shared, by the way, by other Democratic operatives who have been working in this space to elect Democrats, but also with the hopes of electing more women. And I think in part it's because they look at places like Britain, where we were talking about, where you've seen the rise from the conservative side of people like Thatcher, and then currently now with Truss. But other countries across the board, too, who have seen conservative women rise first. People like Angela Merkel, who normalized female leadership in Germany, for example, during her many years as chancellor there. And so history tells the story of conservative women getting there first. There are systemic reasons for that as well, I think. But as I look in the US, part of what's baked into what Secretary Clinton is talking about is that Republicans and conservatives play by different rules when it comes to identity politics. Democrats are much quicker to speak to it directly, consider gender and identity as an asset. This is a party that really wants to see reflective governance and have a party apparatus that mimics what their party coalition actually looks like. On the Republican side, diversity is not necessarily the first thing that people are thinking about there. And in fact, most of the Republican operatives that I spoke to for this book talk about how at the grassroots level, at the base level, talking about gender and identity politics is sort of the kiss of death. They don't want to hear about that. Instead, they want to hear only about merit. And I think that Carly Fiorina, who ran in 2016 in that same large field of men against Trump, the only woman in that field, she represented the Republican dichotomy, I think, really well, where she talked about how it's different when you're different, allowing the idea that genderism and misogyny is very much at play still in Republican politics, and then quickly pivoting back to the talking point that it has to be about merit, as if running gender forward and identity forward and showing up how we show up somehow takes away from the merit argument, which I don't actually think that it does. And what we're now seeing, and I think is going to be fascinating, is when people like Liz Cheney or, even Carrie Lake or other people who are running and gaining steam on the Republican side, is the ways in which they end up talking about or not talking about gender, because it's going to be there no matter what. It's just whether or not you want to speak to it. And I think Liz Cheney is doing something fascinating lately, where even just recently at a Republican dinner, she said something along the lines of, men have been running things for a while and it's not been going so well.
Right.
And that's not something that I expected to hear from a conservative, let alone Liz Cheney. But here we are in the year 2022.
But, she's different in many respects. I mean,
Yes.
Because she's defiant. She's defying her party. She's clinging to conservative principles, traditionally conservative principles. She is fighting for our democracy. Does that make her different, Ali? And if so, does it make her more of a prospect as a presidential candidate than we may have had in the past?
It makes her different in the age of Trump, right? Because I think what Cheney is doing in speaking to gender and toying with it as overtly as she is actually kind of the antithesis of what it is to be conservative, even in the mold of Cheney conservatism. Because you think about the women who were at the height of power, at the height of Cheney, frankly, people like Condoleezza Rice, who were not out there gender first, race first. That was certainly talked about because they were barrier breaking. But at the same time, that's not really the Republican Party way, is to tout the diversity achievements of their party. They know they have to do it. That's why they have people like initially Cheney, but now Elise Stefanik, in part why they have them in their leadership structure. But it's also been an uphill climb to get Republicans to pay attention to needing to invest in female candidates in primaries. And I say in primaries because the reason that I focus in this book on the Democratic primary is because it's in primaries that a lot of these isms and the structural inequities are so much more impactful. Because once you get to a general election, when women run, they win at generally the same rates as men do. People are pretty tribal, especially in presidentials. If you're a Dem, you vote for the Dem. If you're a Republican, you vote for the Republican. It kind of is what it is. It's in primaries when you're selecting your nominee that a lot of these forces are really at play. And so look, for Cheney, I actually think she's fascinating because she represents right now the fact that women are at the forefront of the accountability movement against Trump. It's Cheney on the January 6th committee, but it's also the fact that you had women like Cassidy Hutchinson coming forward, Sarah Matthews coming forward. Then, of course, if you look at just the accountability structure outside of Washington, D.C., with the Fulton County DA, and then Tish James here in New York, the Attorney General, all of these women are at each forefront of holding Trump accountable at the myriad level of investigations that are happening against him right now. And I do think that there's something to that. The fact that she is showing strength and bravery and being willing to buck her party, those are things that are actually typically rewarded in the Republican structure of old times. But now that the structure has become so Trump-centric, I'm actually fascinated to see what ends up happening, because I do think she'll run in 2024, even if it's just to be someone who can stand on a Republican debate stage and go at the former president in a way that no one else on that stage will do.
And add to the accountability.
Yeah.
The women who held Trump accountable, Nancy Pelosi throughout the Trump presidency, holding him accountable for his behavior.
Yes, that's a great point.
Ali, let me turn our attention to another potential candidate in 2024, 2028, namely Vice President Harris, whom we just had as a
Yeah.
visitor here at the LBJ Library. The vice president's approval ratings are generally quite a bit lower than those of Joe Biden, most recently 37% versus Biden's 42%. And generally speaking, I think it's probably fair to say that Vice President Harris has been judged pretty harshly. But to what extent does that have to do with her being a woman?
I think that her gender and race are inextricable when we consider the role that she plays right now as vice president and the way that it's received publicly. I think there's the political piece of this, which is that there's extra scrutiny applied to her because everyone assumes she's going to be a presidential candidate, if not in 2 years, then in 6 years, because she is someone who has a long political runway ahead of her. At the same time, though, I think so much of the criticism of Kamala Harris comes from the place of we don't really know what to do with her. It's hard to metabolize the role of a vice president anyway, because that role is largely such a supporting role if you're doing it right. But with her, the fact that she doesn't look like any of the people who have done that job before, there was almost this unfair expectation that she would come in, blow up the whole structure and build it anew because she's someone who's new in that role. And that's a fundamentally unfair expectation. So many people throughout the writing of this book, people who criticized her, people who haven't, people who support her, all said that it's fundamentally unfair for Americans to believe that Kamala Harris is going to come in and just completely redo the role of vice president because she's the first female and person of color vice president. That's unfair. At the same time, there have been stumbles. A lot of the media appearances, especially those around the border, that's when you start to see her approval ratings starting to tank. But it's not surprising that they're in line with where the presidents are, even if they're a little bit lower, because vice presidents are tagged with the baggage and the successes of their presidents. Those are the rules of this game. And if she wants to run again, she better hope that Biden is in a good position when she decides to do so, because that's what has dictated so many of the vice presidents who have tried to go on to be president. Look at Biden. The fact that Obama was revered within the Democratic Party apparatus, that Biden could be considered a callback to the happier years of Obama, despite the fact that I remember a lot of times when Democrats weren't super thrilled with the Obama presidency. The fact that with time, Biden was tagged with that nostalgia factor, that really helped him. So Kamala is going to be inextricably linked with Biden, but her gender and race are inextricably linked with her and her future and current political prospects.
So gender and race are both huge obstacles, but we elected a president, not only an African-American president, but a president named Barack Hussein Obama. So,
Yeah.
Ali, ultimately, what is the greater burden for a candidate, race or gender?
Gosh, this is an idea that I tossed over with a lot of people who worked for Clinton in 2008. And especially even asking Clinton about this, she says this was a choice between history in a racial sense and history in a gender sense. That was the dichotomy in 2008, truly. And I think that just because a Black man got there first doesn't necessarily say that we are willing to be more sexist than we are racist. I don't know that I'm ready to draw that conclusion, though some people that I spoke to were. But I think it teaches a larger lesson about what it will eventually take to make history, which is that when Obama ran, certainly he was a long shot for all the political metrics that we assigned to it. The fact that he hadn't spent much time in the Senate, his resume was frankly pretty thin. Those were the things politically that were working against him. But the idea that Barack Obama could be electable in a place like Iowa, especially, I think that was something where once he proved it, it showed that the electability metric was both theoretical and also something that like you could put meat behind. And you watched the women in 2020 actually try to do this. There was a moment on the debate stage where Elizabeth Warren says, it's her and Klobuchar, the last two women left standing. And Elizabeth Warren says that of the women, of the people on this stage, the only two people who had won all their races were Elizabeth Warren and Amy Klobuchar. It was the women who had proven their electability. And yet Mayor Pete was being given the benefit of the doubt that he could win, despite the fact that when he tried to run outside of South Bend, he lost in Indiana. Joe Biden had run for president twice before, never notched any primary wins, but he was somehow seen as the most electable, least risk. And there was Warren saying, we've proven that people will vote for us in big marquee Senate races multiple times. And that still wasn't enough, which is why the conclusion of the book doesn't mean to be quaint, but it kind of is, which is like, we're going to get there when we get there. And when we do, it somehow doesn't seem so insurmountable for the person who's going to come next.
Ali, let's turn our attention for a sec back to the future. You write in the book, speaking of the presidency, the ceiling will not be broken in just one shot. It will be chipped away bit by bit, shattered crack by crack. And part of what you seem to have in mind here is that it's important to get more women involved in the political process and running for office to kind of, to use your term, have more people in the pipeline. Talk about what is needed in your view to get more women involved in the political process and running for office.
So there are several studies that I point to in the book about the barriers to entry, even when you're a young woman in high school and in college. The fact that women at that age are reporting lower desires and confidences in themselves of entering the political space, in part because people aren't really telling them you should run. It's not happening for women at the same rates as we often tell men that you should run for things. And so it's part of why there are so many different organizations now that try to get women into the pipeline, to continue using that word, but into the pipeline at as young an age as possible so that they are able to build political resumes, not from the time that they start at 50, but so that they start when they're in their 20s, in their 30s. And quite frankly, it's why seeing what people like Elizabeth Warren were doing on the campaign trail, she would do these pinky promises with all kids, but especially little girls. They would come up to her with their moms after events. She would get down at eye level. She would take their pinky and she would say, I'm Elizabeth Warren and I'm running for president because that's what girls do. There's a socialization aspect of this, showing people that they can grow up to be in these spaces. It's not just looking at the placemat that has only male faces on it when you look at who the presidents have been. It's actively trying to rework that framework and take women from their youngest, most formative ages and show them not only that they can aspire to a career in politics, but that politics needs their worldview in order to make our democracy more reflective and better governing for the entire population.
And you express confidence at the end of the book that we will have a female president. Certainly, that's inevitable, Ali. In
I hope so.
In 24, in 28, but you don't give an exact prediction. Given what's happened since you've written your book, would you wager a guess as to when we may be bold enough as a nation to elect a female president?
So look, I retired my crystal ball after the 2016 election.
As did so many of us, Ali.
Can't imagine
I know I'm not alone. There's a closet of crystal balls somewhere of the whole media apparatus and political apparatus. So mine's in there with that. But look, for the reasons that we've laid out here, that's why I'm confident that we'll get there. And again, I don't put a time on it because I think that political time is so flimsy. So much can change even between right now when we're talking at the end of 2022 and early next year when we're probably going to see people start announcing for president. Like the conventional knowledge right now is that it's going to be, frankly, like another Biden versus Trump. Like that we're going to just get to redo 2020 without the entire Democratic primary that focused on healthcare. Yeah. Who's to say whether that's actually the right way of assuming what's going to happen here? We don't know what the midterms are going to bring. We don't know if it's going to be a Republican House, a Democratic Senate, a Republican. There's so much we don't know. And so I hesitate to say that 2024 is the year or 2028 is the year because, again, the crystal ball is in retirement. But at the same time, I feel very confident about it, in large part because of the women on both sides who I don't even have to think too hard about to make up the bench. Yeah. And I think that that's a sign that both parties have a really long road ahead of them when it comes to having female leaders at their highest echelons. And that's really important to getting there.
Ali, between the moment when you finished your book and the moment when it was published, the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade, obviously a momentous occasion in American politics. How do you see that affecting the dynamics that female candidates will confront in forthcoming elections?
Yeah, you're triggering someone who wrote a book and then major news happened that could have easily fit into the book. But look, I view this moment around reproductive access as a critical inflection point, not just for women, but for everyone. But I do think that it's a reminder of the fact that having people who have direct experiences making policy is really important. The fact that you had a majority male court making this decision governing women's bodies is something that I don't think that we can not have as a key part of the conversation. But it's also something that's clearly galvanizing women voters. Not to say that they just only want to vote for women to represent them in this moment, because again, this is something for men and women to be concerned about. But I think the way that you look at, and we're going to bear this out, if suburban women are motivated to come out and not vote Republican and vote Democrat, I think that's going to be really interesting. And again, as someone who's covered reproductive access for years now, this is a moment that both Republicans and Democrats have been pushing towards and warning about, this post-Roe reality. We're here now. It's an untested moment for the electorate, for politicians, for this country. And 10 years from now, this will be an inflection point. I don't know in what way. Yep. Republicans could easily be the dog that caught the car and then got run over by it in an election cycle where they should have been running away with the map. Or Democrats could have really overplayed their hand, and this is not the issue that ends up galvanizing voters. I tend to think that it's going to be somewhere in between, but we'll see.
Ali, we see a trend in the world toward authoritarianism. We're seeing it in Russia today. And there are many nations throughout the world where tyrannical authoritarian leaders are coming to power. But there's a definite link between authoritarianism and misogyny. How do you explain that?
I don't know that I can explain it, but I think certainly exploring the link is a really worthwhile thing, because you can't have a strong man without a man, right? Like that is sort of part and parcel to the idea that to be authoritarian is to be the ultimate of executive power, and frankly, to be every embodiment of being hypermasculine. It's why you see Putin doing those things like riding the horse shirtless, right? Or even just, the ways in which he often presents his power is very hypermasculine. But then there are also people who make comparison points to the way that Trump has tried to consolidate power in the United States. The idea that he has said things that are complimentary of strongmen, of people like Putin, but also complimentary of people like Kim Jong-un, even Xi Jinping, who, of course, not in the same vein as the other two, but the sole leader of the Communist Party there in China. So certainly, I think there are gendered tones to this too. But I also think the other thing that I'm struck by is, as you look at the rise of nationalistic politicians, which Trump sort of was an early sign of the wave there. You then look in places like France and in Italy, and there are women on the hyper-conservative ends of those spectrums who are leading there as well. And so it's not to say that only men can be leaders on the far rights of their party. Women are there too. But I think when you're only looking at autocrats and strongmen, man is part of the feature there.
Our guest is Ali Vitali, and her very readable book is Electable. Ali, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you, guys. This was really fun.
My thanks to our sponsors, the Moody Foundation and St. David's Healthcare, and as always, to you for joining us. If you've enjoyed this episode, subscribe, rate, and review us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. I'm Mark Lawrence. See you next time.